Since people have been engaging in sexual activities, they have been hoping to be able to in some way control or prevent pregnancy. This has led to some questionable, if not flat-out dangerous innovations, from animal poop and intestines to honey and stones, to mercury and even tortoise shells. From ancient times on, people have tried anything and everything as a type of contraceptive. While some may have been effective, many were not, and some were even deadly. Let's discuss all of these different creations over time in this episode of the Infographics Show, The Horrible History of Contraception. In 1850 BCE, the Egyptians used the waste of their crocodilian friends of the Nile in their out-of-the-box efforts to prevent pregnancy. Fortunately, it was at least dried out before being inserted into a woman's genitalia and mixed first with a bit of sticky honey. Those who used it assumed it would soften and expand to form a barrier to sperm once inside. As the preferred food of the Nile crocodile is fish, though it will also feast upon decaying carrion, one can only guess how pleasant its feces and its smell is. It's likely something that even the sweetness of honey couldn't fix. To add insult to injury, it also didn't work. In fact, crocodile dung changes the pH of the body and thus actually improves the odds of conceiving. By 1550 BCE, the Egyptians began to mix it up with the applications of acacia leaves and honey. These would sometimes be combined with wool and lint as a type of sperm-fighting tampon. Now, whoever came up with this idea was really onto something. Acacia ended up fermenting into lactic acid within the woman's body, which does have true spermicidal properties. Further, the application of wool or lint in the vaginal opening became an effective physical barrier to sperm-seeking entry. While it was described in ancient Cretan manuscripts 2,000 years earlier, the Egyptians were among the first group known to wear a rudimentary condom in 1000 BCE. Though at this point in history they were made of linen and intended more for disease prevention than as a form of birth control. Beyond this, they were even colored and flaunted as a type of status symbol among Egyptian men. We have mixed feelings about whether or not we're sad this is no longer done. By 700 BCE, Romans were using the bladders of goats, sheep, and other unfortunate animals as a type of condom similarly to the Egyptians, because nothing says let's get it on like the application of a hollowed-out animal organ that once stored animal urine. However, even at this time, they were still mostly worn to protect women from sexually transmitted infections and in the interest of public health rather than to avoid pregnancy. It's believed that later on, the Jukas tribe in New Guinea began to recognize them for their current use in family planning. They also designed a nifty woman's condom in efforts at conception prevention. By 220 BCE, Romans came up with the worst idea yet. Yeah, worse than using animal organs or crocodile poop. A popular method of the region was to place a hard stone or bronze object up into the woman's reproductive tract. This worked as a diaphragm or a cervical cap, but we can safely assume it was far less comfortable than pliable modern-day versions. Dioscorides, a Greek doctor in ancient times, suggested using peppermint oil when inserting an object of this type meant to block or kill sperm. This would have numbed the area and given the woman more comfort during intercourse, but we're still going to call this a bad idea nonetheless. Roman gynecologist Soranus had several suggestions of his own. The first was that women should abstain from sex during their periods, which he thought was their most fertile time, and when they would be most likely to get pregnant. Of course, for those with a regular and predictable cycle, this is not the case. He also believed that women should stop breathing while the man finished, and then proceed to perform squats and sneeze to fight the sperm's movement in a strange combination of downward pressure and gravity. Finally, they were instructed to clean themselves in order to fully avoid pregnancy. For obvious reasons, this approach was less effective than those that used things such as natural spermicides or forms of cervical blockage. Somewhat surprisingly, it was biblical texts that followed that described a much less complex method. The Old Testament, which experts believe was first written in ancient Hebrew and originated in either the 6th century BC or, due to newly discovered evidence as far back as 4 centuries prior, detailed the pull-out method. It was specifically in Genesis, when talking about the actions of a man named Onan, that this alternative method still practiced today was first mentioned. Specifically, Onan used it so that his semen fell to the ground and would not impregnate his brother's wife. He was then struck dead by God, some believe because he attempted to separate pleasure from the responsibilities of creating life. This indicates that anywhere from this time on, men and women were aware of this way to supposedly delay or prevent parenthood. However, many refer to it not as the pull-out method, but instead as the pull-and-pray one. They have a good reason. Doctors find that 28 out of every 100 women who use this as their sole form of contraception will become pregnant within the span of a year. In the case of 10th century Persia, it's likely that the chances of women conceiving were even higher. This is because they followed beliefs that had women not squatting down, but jumping in the backwards direction. They were told to jump a magical number of times, which would encourage any sperm within them to fall out. Those who failed to jump 7 or 9 times would not experience any benefits, while those who did would remain baby-free. If only it were that easy. In contrast, the ancient Chinese habit of drinking liquid mercury or ingesting mercury tablets definitely made an impact, though not its intended one. While they were hoping it would prevent pregnancy, it's not exactly known how much of an effect it had in that area. Unless we're talking about a woman's death and thus her inability to do anything at all, let alone procreate. This is because mercury is a highly poisonous neurotoxin that can cause muscle weakness and twitching, headaches, respiratory failure, and as we just mentioned, an untimely death. For these reasons, this practice was eventually discontinued. 12th century China had more success as a result of the country's use of a less fatal method. Taking advantage of their vast knowledge in the production of silk, they created a penile sheath of silk paper. To this, they also added some oily lube. However, the purpose of this oil was not only to enhance pleasure, but in the belief that it could also help impair sperm health and movement. China was not the only area to have a few historical rough patches in their pregnancy prevention technology. Dangerous contraceptive measures were also used in 4th century Greece, in addition to the likely pleasant combinations of frankincense and cedar oil thought to act as spermicides. Women would sometimes anoint themselves internally with lead. They would even drink the water used by blacksmiths, contaminated with the same metal, for pregnancy termination purposes. Unfortunately, lead poisoning is quite serious and can lead to increased blood pressure, pain, impaired memory, headaches, and mental disorders. It does cause a lower sperm count in men and miscarriage, premature birth, or stillbirth among the babies of women, but it does so at a cost. Incredibly, sources claim that women thought of lead exposure as helpful for pregnancy prevention as late in history as World War I. While technically safer than metal ingestion, 13th century Japan ranks up there with the Romans' use of bronze objects or rocks for the method likely to bring the least comfort or pleasure to women, let alone men. One civilization created what was called the kabuta gata, which was essentially a covering for the male reproductive organ made from the shell of a tortoise. The good news is that it was also, though much more infrequently, fashioned from a more pliable leather. In the case of the shell, nothing says romance like hard, inflexible covering on your appendage. The good thing about the contraption was that those with erectile dysfunction could often treat or disguise their condition. It is likely that the recipient of their affections would be unaware of almost anything but their pain. It was in the 14th century that anatomist Gabriele Falloppio suggested the use of a superior condom in England. These protective covers weren't as fancy as Chinese silken versions, but were better than Japanese shells and were made out of linen. Further, they had some extra decoration and were tied off at the top with a flare of ribbon. During the European Renaissance, condoms made out of animal intestines became increasingly popular. This was in an effort to once again prevent disease transmission, as well as to keep in check any nightly transgressions of the royals that would result in illegitimate children. Any intestines were fair game, from the smaller fish to the larger sheep, depending on the size necessary. The Middle Ages of Europe saw some stranger trends in contraception efforts. Women were given weasel testicles and were instructed to tie them on their bodies while engaging in sexual activities. It's hard to picture getting down and dirty with reproductive organs from a furry mammal wrapped around your thighs or neck. However, in England at the time, this was not only an accepted but encouraged thing to do. The Elizabethan period in 16th century England brought about some less disgusting, though potentially quite painful ideas. Women were told to wash their intimate areas both externally and internally with acetic acid, or in other words, vinegar. Prostitutes at the time would soak sponges in the stuff and then apply it before intercourse as a way to kill off sperm. As we just mentioned, this contains acid, though it is quite dilute. However, in the case of any cuts or sores, it would be sure to sting intensely. Another stinging object was described in the memoirs of the infamous Italian heartthrob Glaucoma Casanova. Casanova was rumored to have seduced many of the female population and knew a thing or two about not ruining romance with daddy duty. His technique was to cut a lemon in half and then hollow out all of its insides. This hollowed out half a fruit would then be inserted inside the woman as a type of cervical cap. This natural approach was mimicked much later on with rubber versions that used the same underlying concept. These were available on the market by 1927. Surprisingly, crazy contraception ideas weren't reserved for just long-ago societies. As recently as the 1950s, people believed that the carbonic acid within carbonated soft drinks would kill sperm and that their sugar content induced sperm combustion. After intercourse, women would take a bottle, shake it up, and then insert it within themselves while opening it. While this was undoubtedly quite entertaining to observe, it was rather unsurprisingly proven to not be at all effective. Clearly, despite this strange 1950s behavior, contraception has made significant strides since antiquity. We can be quite glad for the improvements of these scary, at times painful, and occasionally deadly attempts at birth control throughout history. Though in some areas, changes did not take place to make modern forms of birth control widely available, let alone acceptable, until surprisingly recently. All forms of contraception were illegal in Ireland in 1935 until 1985, though the pill was available in the instance of a medical disorder. The pill wasn't available in the United States until 1960, when it received FDA approval, and in Japan it wasn't legalized until as recently as 1999. Though, as they say, better late than never. Now that we've covered this horrible history of contraception, we wonder, will you ever look at honey, lemons, or soda the same way again? Let us know in the comments. Also, be sure to check out our other video called Worst Punishments in the History of Mankind. Thanks for watching, and as always, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. We'll see you next time.